Then he told the man, stretch out your hand. And so he stretched it out. What? An amazing miracle. How did the Pharisees respond? With their hearts filled with so much preconceived notions of what the grace of God is supposed to look like, the only response the Pharisees could muster up to the healing power of God being manifested right before their eyes was hatred. To be fair, right? To play the devil's advocate. In their minds, they had some righteous anger because they were trying their best to follow Yahweh. And by golly, if everyone else wasn't trying to do it, then who was followers of Yahweh anyways? What was happening here was this disregard for what they'd given their life to. I get that. Why? Because in many instances of my life, I've done the same. I know myself all too well. And if you were honest with yourself too, you know that the distance between us and the Pharisees is really just one inconvenience, just one temper tantrum away, so to say. My obsessions with what I think people are doing wrong, in fact, what they end up doing is they remove my ability to be aware of the actual miracles God is performing right in front of me. And he's actually inviting me to be a part of. There are things that I get really ooh, it just really gets me. And I feel really spiritual and I feel like righteous anger about it. And I'm just so passionate about it. And I think about it all the time. And I think about how I can help other people understand and see things the way I see them and think how I think. And I'm always looking for those opportunities that I actually miss out on the certain things that maybe that God's really doing, that he's really miraculously putting in front of me. There's some things that maybe God is actually saying, hey, here, I'm doing a great work. Pay attention to this, but you're too busy going to no, I got this passion. I got this passion for this certain thing that I'm really good about. And I do this. And I don't know, maybe you do this. And when I read the story of the Pharisees, sometimes I want to be like, I can't believe you would do that. But then sometimes when I'm honest with myself, I go oh my goodness, I do that too. I don't know what you take away from this passage. But when I read this, I see Jesus desiring that a new kind of system would exist in replacement of a system of rules and regulations for achieving both salvation and spiritual growth. A system not built on the ability to demonstrate the kind of sacrifice you're willing to make for God, but instead the commitment to show Christ-like compassion to people who are made in the image of God. Go and learn this. I desire mercy, not all the things that you do for God, your sacrifice. So in the middle of this grain field, near the Sea of Galilee, we find Matthew writing this story. At that time, Jesus passed through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick and eat some heads of grain. Verse 2. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "See, your disciples are doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath." So here we have one group of people, they're hungry. They're a hungry group of followers of Jesus. And the disciples do what seems natural and what seems familiar in their culture during that time, which was to, if you're passing through a field of grain, it's natural, it's familiar to just, if you're hungry, just to kind of swipe and grab a handful of grain and, rub it in your hands, get the chaff off, and just go ahead and have your little bit of granola, all right? Now, most God-fearing Jews were familiar with the passage of scripture written in the Old Testament, which for some of us, we look at this like, they're stealing. Like, who would do that, right? Well, here's the background. In Deuteronomy 23:25, God-fearing Jews would have understood this. When you enter your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck heads of grain with your hand, but do not put a sickle to your neighbor's grain. In other words, hey, there was some laws here that were being set out. Like, look, it's fine. You're walking through your neighbor's grain. Nothing's wrong with you grabbing just a handful, but don't go taking a sickle and now making enough, harvest for yourself so you can bake yourself a loaf, right? The idea that's like, hey, if you're hungry, it's okay. Now, that was the first group of people, hungry disciples of Jesus, walking through the fields. The second group of people is not the kind you would expect to see, honestly, if you think about it, randomly hanging out in the middle of a grain field on Saturday. And in fact, I literally laughed out loud when one of my favorite Bible scholars who wrote in his commentary of this section of Matthew, he wrote this. He goes, what were the Pharisees doing there? Like, he literally just goes, and by the way, what in the world were the Pharisees doing in a grain field on a Saturday, on a Sabbath? Literally. Now, whether they were following the disciples to catch them doing something that they thought was bad, or maybe hanging out in grain fields was like a way to disconnect from city life, like pastors go to the Boundary Waters during the summer, What we see is that they take issue with the fact that the disciples are eating grain that they've plucked from the field. That's what they're taking issue with. Now, they don't accuse them of stealing grain from someone else's land. Instead, they accuse them of breaking this law that was somehow created to protect people from breaking the actual law, which was set to observe the Sabbath, to remember the Sabbath. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Old Testament understanding of the Sabbath, the most straightforward way, now some of you who've maybe done a word study on this whole Sabbath thing, you're going to be like, oh, you're oversimplifying, Phillip. Yes, I am. But just for the sake of talking about the Sabbath, the most straightforward way to explain what the Sabbath is, it's basically this. It's that God gave the people of Israel a gift. The Sabbath was a gift of resting from work. As simple as I can say. Sabbath was this principle of the idea, here is a gift for you. Your life doesn't have to be all about your work. It doesn't have to be all about what you're trying to do to provide for yourself. It doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be that thing that you're tempted to make your identity. It's a gift, okay? So in its most simplest form. In fact, Exodus 34:21 says this, you are to labor 6 days, but you must rest on the seventh day. You must even rest during plowing and harvesting times. So even when it feels like, well, I don't have the time to rest, God said, no, I want to give you a gift. It's going to be okay. Listen, it is literally okay. You don't have to. But I haven't. We're going to miss a day of harvest. No. It's okay. The problem was, so that's a great thing, right? It sounds like a really great gift, right? The problem was that over time, this gift, which was meant to bless the people of God, became a complex web of rules and regulations. They weren't just protecting the Sabbath, they were building a fence around it, and then they said, like, well, that's a pretty good fence. Like, we want to remember the Sabbath, so like, how can we make sure we're not working on the Sabbath? Well, make sure I don't go to the grain field. Well, how can we make sure that no one else is breaking that? Well, like, let's just say anybody who does anything like rubbing grain in their hand, because that's what people who work in the fields do. Well, yeah, we're going to make that. That's a kind of work. And so therefore, we're going to say that's just as important of a law as remembering the Sabbath. And so they're building these fences around it, and then another fence, and then another fence. In fact, devout Jews had 39 different categories just around work that were prohibited. And it wasn't just the big stuff. Even travel was restricted. You can see this most plainly when you find the phrase, if you read the New Testament, you'll often hear this phrase, and so they were traveling a Sabbath's day journey. You might have heard that or seen that, right? A Sabbath's day journey. Like, what does that mean by a Sabbath's day journey? Well, in the scriptures, they were talking about this because the Jews had already set this time that during the Sabbath, no one could travel more than about half a mile, okay? Because to do so would be, oh, now you're flirting with working, because like if you have to work that far, then you're probably not resting. And so this phrase became popular. Say it's about, a Sabbath's day journey. Just like if I said, hey, how far is, Woodbury from here? It's like a St. Michael's Day journey, right? We all kind of get that. Now, here's the thing. Rules, I get it. Rules can be helpful, right? Rules can be helpful. They can provide structure. But what happens when rules become the main thing? What happens when we lose sight of why rules were given in the first place. This is what Jesus confronts when he replies to the Pharisees, and he says this. Look at verse 3. Jesus says, he said to them, have you read what David did when he and those who were with him were hungry? How he had entered the house of God and he ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for him or for those who eat, for those with him to eat, but only for the priest. So, don't have a lot of time to go into this, but Jesus is basically pointing into a story in 1 Samuel chapter 21 where David and his men, they're hungry and they go into the temple and they're like, hey, we're hungry, feed us. And they're like, oh, all we have is the showbread or the bread of presence. And there are these 12 loaves that represented the 12 tribes of Israel. And the priests were allowed to eat it after all the ceremony that they went through, you know, like a lot of that was very symbolic. And so you had all this bread left over, and because it was there, the priests were allowed to eat it, but nobody else was allowed to eat it. That was like forbidden. But the priests went ahead and said, here you go, David, here you go, take the bread, take the bread. And so this supposed Sabbath rule that existed back then in David's scenario, and all the Pharisees would have been very familiar with the story. They knew that in this instance, the Sabbath rules really didn't have any consequence when it seemed as if though they were doing something that was against the law. But then Jesus points to another example and said this in verse 5. He goes, or haven't you read in the law that on Sabbath days the priests in the temple violate the Sabbath and are innocent? So just in case someone's like, oh, Jesus, that has nothing to do with working. We're accusing your guys of working, and you're putting like an eating thing. Like, it's like, okay, here's a better example. When's the Sabbath? Who's on Saturday? Do priests work on the Sabbath? Well, you know, they do. They help with that's the day that they work. I mean, it's the only day that they work, right? Right? Priests, right? That's what they do. That's what. Well, aren't they guilty of the Sabbath? Well, no, because you're not supposed to work, but they're priests, you know, like, so it's okay. Like, and Jesus is like, you know, like. Jesus is like, okay. The priests in doing their God-given work were technically breaking the law. And the point that Jesus was trying to make was that when it comes to the Sabbath, listen, there is a bigger picture. It's not just about following the letter of the law. It's about understanding the spirit of the law. And then Jesus says something really that just blows my mind. Verse 6, he says this, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. Something greater than the temple is here. Like, whoa, what does he mean by that? What does he mean by that? Well, another favorite theologian of mine, Tom Wright, or N.T. Wright sometimes goes by, explains the meaning of this context of everything Jesus said during this confrontation with the Pharisees best when he wrote this, and I just want to share it with you. He writes, Jesus doesn't take the easy way out of explaining that they were hungry, and that maybe human hunger overrides Sabbath law. He raised the stakes much higher, talking of something King David did in God's house. This isn't just an ancient biblical example of how someone got around the law. It's much more powerful and much more dangerous story for Jesus to line himself up with. This time, it isn't just that people matter more than things. It's that Jesus and his followers matter more than the temple. Now, we don't get that here because we're people who meet in the school. But if you ever grew up in a very classic church, right? I mean, some of you remember in the 90s when it was cool for churches to bring coffee into the sanctuary. And I don't know if you went to some of these, you were, oh boy, if I brought a coffee into the church I grew up with, the elders would be on me like white on rice. I'm just telling you why, because you don't desecrate the sanctuary, right? And here we are in the year 2000, right? But back then, even more so, the idea of the temple has this great reverence. And here's Jesus was saying, guess what? Something greater than the temple exists in front of you. If this wasn't enough to rattle the Pharisees, Jesus quotes from Hosea 6:6 like he did back in Matthew chapter 9 when confronted by the religious leaders for choosing. Some of you remember when Jesus was eating with Matthew, and Matthew threw this party right in Matthew 9. He invited all of his friends, which happened to be sinners and tax collectors. Why? Because he was a sinner and he was a tax collector. So he just invited the people that he knew to meet this guy named Jesus. And what did the Pharisees say? They say, "Why do you eat with such sinners and tax collectors?" In other words, they were saying, why was Jesus eating with these people who are sinners and degenerate members of society? We don't maybe think of tax collectors in that way, but they were basically accusing Jesus of being someone who, stupidly or unwisely associated with people who made choices that were incongruent with God's standards and were known in the community as people that were degenerate and immoral. And so Jesus says this in verse 7, quoting from Hosea 6:6, if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. You wouldn't have said anything bad about the disciples. They're innocent. And focusing on the rules and regulations they believe would somehow earn favor with God, they completely missed the heart of God. The Pharisees focused on these rules and regulations, hoping that it would touch the heart of God. But they actually, in doing so, completely missed the heart of God. Or as one Bible scholar poignantly put it, Jesus always emphasized the intent of the law, the meaning behind the letter. The Pharisees lost the spirit of the law and were rigidly demanding that the letter and their interpretation of it be obeyed. Okay, so here's the situation going, and when you just think that Jesus couldn't say anything more to offend the Pharisees, right? First he pulls out the scripture and he goes like, "Come on, you know this," and then he says like, if you would even understand what Hosea 6:6, saying that they were guilty of not even following the law, right? He says this in verse 8 through 12. Look at this. Actually, in verse 8, "For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." For the Son of Man. Look, Jesus is basically saying, look, I'm not a good teacher. In some of these instances, you'll hear the Pharisees will call to Jesus like, "Oh, good teacher." Look, I'm not a good teacher, Jesus says. I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I am making a divine claim that he is the one who actually defines the Sabbath itself. Later, you can read in the book of Hebrews where it talks about this idea of finding our Sabbath rest in Christ. And so you can take a look. We don't have time to dive into all that. But what you need to know here is that Jesus is capping off this confrontation with basically saying, look, and by the way, I can say all this because I am the Lord of the Sabbath. All of this, I define. And I would have loved to have known what kind of reaction the Pharisees had to what Jesus said, but Matthew doesn't record that. Instead, he gives another illustration of Jesus reorienting people's perspective of the purpose of the Sabbath. In verse 9, Matthew goes on, moving on from there, he entered their synagogue. There he saw a man who had a shriveled hand, and in order to accuse him, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" Now it's interesting to note here that the religious leaders see the crippled hand, and the first thing that comes to their mind is how they can use this crippled person as a pawn for their theological chess game with Jesus. They aren't interested in the fact that the man is actually suffering. They don't ask Jesus if it's lawful to heal on the Sabbath because they think Jesus is a Sabbath honoring type of guy, and they're just really worried. They're like, "Jesus, you can heal, and I know you're God-fearing, and you're probably not going to heal him, but like, would you do it? Is it lawful? Come on, Jesus, would you do it?" That's not what they were thinking in their mind. They were asking because they wanted to catch Jesus breaking their interpretation of the Sabbath. They actually knew Jesus was going to do this, and they were looking for an opportunity to catch Jesus in the act of breaking their interpretation of the law. But in his wisdom, Jesus turns the tables and asks them a simple question that requires no depth of actual theological knowledge to answer. He doesn't reply with scripture verses. He doesn't reply with theology. He goes to what you and I both know to be true, whether you're religious or not. And he says this in verse 11, who among you, if he had a sheep that fell into a pit on the Sabbath, wouldn't take a hold of it and lift it out? Isn't a person worth more than a sheep? So, it is lawful to do what is good. You think it's work, but you've missed the point. It's always lawful to do what is good on the Sabbath. It's interesting to note that these religious leaders, right, like they see this crippled man, but they don't see an opportunity for healing. And even by their own standards, helping an animal was okay on the Sabbath. It's like Jesus was saying, look, don't you get it? Don't you get it? People matter more than your man-made rules. Listen, I know you love your rules, but listen, people matter more. Compassion matters more than your ability to go through the motions of what you think are the actions that will please God. Compassion matters more. And so Jesus said what he said, and I can only imagine after saying that, I mean, come on, you could probably hear a pin drop in the silence of the words that he created. In fact, I was doing some research in this for this message. It took me a while to find this, but I actually did find a piece of art hidden in the ruins of Capernaum depicting the Pharisees' response in this moment. Actually, here it is. It's awesome. See, that's okay. Yeah, that's the awkward meme. Now, before anybody could whisper, awkward silence, right? Matthew tells us that Jesus does this in verse 13. Then he told the man, stretch out your hand. And so he stretched it out, and it was restored as good as the other. What an amazing miracle, right? How do the Pharisees respond? With celebration? Woo! With awe? Oh my goodness, we were wrong. No. In the words of Coach Green, they were who we thought they were. And they did it, verse 14 to 15. If you're not from Minnesota, you don't know. But the Pharisees went out and plotted against him, how they might kill him. And Jesus was aware of this and withdrew. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them all. So, listen, with their hearts filled with so much preconceived notions of what the grace of God is supposed to look like, the only response the Pharisees could muster up to the healing power of God being manifested right before their eyes was hatred. To be fair, what they felt in their hearts probably felt like righteous anger. Like, to be fair, right? To play the devil's advocate. In their minds, they had some righteous anger because they were trying their best to follow Yahweh. And by golly, if everyone else wasn't trying to do it, then who was followers of Yahweh anyways? And they probably felt that because, in many instances that what was happening here was this disregard for what they'd given their life to. I get that. Why? Because in many instances of my life, I've witnessed the power of God. I've done the same. I know myself all too well. And if you were honest with yourself too, you know that the distance between us and the Pharisees is really just one inconvenience, just one temper tantrum away, so to say. I see God doing something incredible in other people's lives, and instead of reacting with celebration, I find myself questioning why God isn't doing the same thing in my life. I look at someone else's podcast and they're talking about all the great things that God's doing in their church. And then I'm sitting there going, oh, God, I want to do that in my church. I'm going to do it, right? Here I go. Or I genuinely believe that my so-called righteous anger towards personal passions is godly motivation to see what I feel is his will to be done here on earth. And I do so, my obsessions with what I think people are doing wrong, in fact, what they end up doing is they remove my ability to be aware of the actual miracles God is performing right in front of me. And he's actually inviting me to be a part of. There are things that I get really ooh, it just really gets me. And I feel really spiritual and I feel like righteous anger about it. And I'm just so passionate about it. And I think about it all the time. And I think about how I can help other people understand and see things the way I see them and think how I would think. And I'm always looking for those opportunities that I actually miss out on the certain things that maybe that God's really doing, that he's really miraculously putting in front of me. There's some things that maybe God is actually saying, hey, here, I'm doing a great work. Pay attention to this, but you're too busy going to no, I got this passion. I got this passion for this certain thing that I'm really good about. And I do this. And I don't know, maybe you do this. And when I read the story of the Pharisees, sometimes I want to be like, I can't believe you would do that. But then sometimes when I'm honest with myself, I go oh my goodness, I do that too. I do that too. Aware of their hatred and anger, Jesus withdraws from them, but he doesn't stop ministering. He continues healing people in the face of opposition with a servant's heart. The way Jesus handled his situation with the Pharisees is why Matthew gives the longest Old Testament quote about him in the book of Matthew, proving that Jesus is the true, what we call servant king. Verse 12, chapter 16, it says, he warned them not to make him known, Jesus saying that, so that what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not argue or shout. And no one will hear his voice in the streets. He will not break a bruised reed. And he will definitely not put out a smoldering wick until he has led justice to victory. The nations will put their hope in his name. This isn't a picture of a power-hungry ruler that Matthew is trying to portray. To a people who have slight remembrance of him, Matthew writes his gospel. Matthew also understands that there's a generation of people who had not seen Jesus and walked with him. And so he's recording these words very carefully because he wants people to understand who Jesus is, because they might hear all these great things that Jesus did and this revolution of grace and mercy, and they might get the sense that Jesus would want them to be these vigilantes of the gospel, but he wanted them to understand who Jesus was, and he helps them to understand that Jesus was not like the leaders of his day. He didn't get his cues from leadership books that you find in the library. He didn't come with political force. He did not shout in the streets. And what he definitely didn't do is not bruise a reed or put out a smoldering wick. Now, those are very interesting phrases. And I think D.A. Carson puts it best when he explained it best when he said, what is pictured is a ministry so gentle and compassionate that the weak are not trampled on. This is the reeds and crushed till justice, full of righteousness of God triumphs. And for such a Messiah, most Jews were little prepared for. They were not prepared for a Messiah who was thinking very intently about those who were weak, whose what is the phrase? Whose smoldering wick is slowly going out. The idea of people who are being oppressed or at their wits' end, so we might say. Because a conqueror would think about, how do I take over the systems? And I overlook at the big picture. Because, eventually, if we take over the big systems, then we can help the little people. But no, Jesus said, I'm going to start with the least. In fact, It was Jesus himself who said, blessed are those who are weak. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who are persecuted. He started with those. And for such a Messiah, most Jews were little prepared. And I think sometimes in our own lives, when we want to see the justice of God happen in the realities of our world, we are very little prepared for what this type of servant king might ask us to do in seeing his kingdom come and his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So, what do we make of this? Our passage of scripture today is not just some story from long ago. In fact, I think of it as a mirror that allows us to examine our hearts today. And so I just want to ask a few questions, kind of in light of what we just talked about. Instead of like maybe telling you what you should take away from this and giving you, like 3 points and here's what you should do and we should blah, blah, blah. I just want to ask some questions. It was good enough for Jesus, so I thought I'd give it a try today, if that's okay. Not that I'm Jesus, nor that my questions are as good as his, but this is my attempt, okay? Here's my first question. Are we so focused on the rules that we miss people? Like, let me be a little bit more blunt. Can I be a little bit more blunt? Are there areas where you are more focused on seeing people live out a kind of life you think they should be living, rather than showing compassion to people who are living out the kind of life you wouldn't wish for yourself? Like, are there areas of your life where you're, they should be doing this, blah, 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 rather than looking around and going, who is living the life I wouldn't wish for myself? They need compassion. Because here's the truth, right? You've heard this. You all know this, right? You only have 100% of your time. Whatever you give your time to is what you choose not to give it to. And so every moment, every energy that you spend, I wonder if we would spend it more on trying to find where God's already wanting us to move. Maybe that's too many words. That's a really long point. Allow me to rephrase the question. Here you go. Are there areas of your life where you're more focused on seeing people follow rules than you yourself showing compassion to people? Maybe that's a little bit more clear. Are there areas of your life man, these people just need to, don't they know? Don't they know? And you're scrolling through Instagram, Facebook, or the TikTokers, tickings, whatever's, too old for this stuff. And you just, what's catching your attention is all the stuff that already catches your attention, the stuff that, that's right. Look at him saying that thing. But as you're scrolling, you don't notice the person crying out for help. You're like, oh, that's too sad. You don't notice that friend of yours who has gone silent for 6 months. You don't notice these areas where you should be showing compassion to people. Maybe that's too hard of a question to answer. So I have another one. Maybe you can ask yourself this. Have you prioritized religious expectations over showing grace? I'm just going to dial down in here to the Christians in this crowd. Have you prioritized religious expectations in your everyday life over showing grace to people in your everyday life? I don't know what you take away from this passage. But when I read this, I see Jesus desiring that a new kind of system would exist in replacement of a system of rules and regulations for achieving both salvation and spiritual growth. A system not built on the ability to demonstrate the kind of sacrifice you're willing to make for God, but instead the commitment to show Christ-like compassion to people who are made in the image of God. Go and learn this. I desire mercy, not all the things that you do for God, your sacrifice. The Pharisees valued rules and regulations. That's fine. But Jesus, he valued restoration and reconciliation. This is why the Apostle Paul wrote this, and I quote this passage too many times, but I'm going to keep quoting it until some of you finally say, okay, I get it. Paul says, everything is from God who has reconciled us to himself through Christ and has given us the ministry, given you the ministry, given me the ministry of what? Rule the stuff? No. Reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God has reconciled the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and he has committed the message of reconciliation to what? Us. Therefore, here's what you are. If you are wondering what in the world your life is about, I don't know if that's you. We are. If you want to know what the church is about, there's all this stuff on it. This is what the church should be like. Here's what the church should be like. Christ's ambassadors. Since God is making his appeal through what? Us. And we plead, please, on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. We plead to the world, be reconciled to God. He made the one who did not know sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So in the end, it seems remedial, but it's so true. It's not about what we do for God. It's about what he has done for us in Jesus Christ. I mean, you hear people say that all the time, but in light of what we just read, doesn't that seem a little bit more clear? Doesn't that a little bit more powerful? Isn't that more impactful? Like, it's not about us and what we think. It's literally about Jesus and what he does and what he has done and bringing glory to him and helping people understand the glory of God through Jesus Christ and understand the grace of Christ for them and for their good and for their reconciliation and for the spiritual health of their life. This is what it's about. It's what about Jesus has done. And listen, if we can figure that out, if we can figure out what that looks like for us as a church to be these ambassadors, I guarantee you we will be good news to the world. Because this was good news to us. That he made the one who did not know sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God.